Good afternoon and welcome on behalf of the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. I'm Dr. Tim Welter, a senior research fellow here at the Institute. Thank you for joining us for this fifth public event of our Global Competition Project. In the shadow of the tragedy unfolding in Ukraine, today's event is focused on exploring how DoD is considering implications of the global economic environment in deciding how to provide for the nation's defense and how that impacts America's prosperity and security on a broader societal level. So, what do I mean by that practically? Today we are economic codependence with China, as are many of our closest allies and partners across the globe. Bottom line, the world is interconnected at an unprecedented level in history from an information and economic standpoint, which renders both opportunities and vulnerabilities that can reverberate globally when certain decisions are made and actions taken either regionally or locally to include what's going on in the Ukraine today. That said, economics and information are being operationalized for advantage in the day-to-day global competitive environment, and presumably carry across the entire spectrum of conflict should deterrence fail and things escalate into kinetic exchanges. So what does that mean for how we think about and prepare for conflict across the spectrum from day-to-day competition to all-out war? What are the thresholds distinguishing war from peace, and who has the responsibility and authority to respond? How does this translate to alliance obligations? What are the leverage points for deterrence? I would argue that our defense construct has yet to evolve to effectively deal with some of these 21st century realities. So to that end, the governments of China and Russia have increased certain what we call gray zone activities, actions below the threshold of war as traditionally know it, but which still vitally threaten national security. These gray zone activities, to include propaganda, mass media mis and disinformation, predatory investment practices, economic manipulation and coercion, are being employed regionally and on the broader world stage by Russia and China to make unfair gains in realizing the goals of their respected regimes. More specifically, for today's discussion, gray zone activities have been aimed at disrupting the vitality of the U.S. economy by targeting industry and supply chains that can compromise the weapons, the technology, the infrastructure the U.S. and our partners and allies rely on for national security. Is there a feasible operational approach to address such threats by DoD? Do they even want to have that responsibility and or authority? If not, who across the government does? And how do we work with international partners to address the challenges at a societal level? Thankfully, there's a growing consensus among policymakers, industry, and others that tangible means to effectively combat gray zone and other contemporary threats stemming from our uber-connected world is a policy and operational imperative. From a DoD perspective, that consensus arguably started with, or was at least accelerated by, the 2018 National Defense Strategy. As you know, that NDS directed a shift in focus to great power competition and inspired a push for organizational changes from the top down across the Department of Defense, rendering legitimacy and support for initiatives like DIU, the Defense Innovation Unit, AFWorks, Army Futures Command, Air Force Futures, to name a few, all focused on the services, working with industry and others to design, develop, and field more relevant capabilities quicker. Despite this progress, is DoD, Congress, the budget process still too focused on developing and fielding traditional platforms and capabilities rather than those which address the realities of the current competitive environment? There are glimmers of hope. The House Armed Services Committee's task force on the future of defense examined these challenges and provided tenable recommendations. That's not the only place. Some of those recommendations have actually made their way into provisions of legislation to include the 2022 NDAA mandate for the planning, Programming, Budgeting, and Execution Reform Commission. And in diversions of competition-focused legislation recently passed by the House and Senate that seek to drive new collaborative efforts between business, research, academia, and government. So to that end, how does government incentivize mutually beneficial public-private partnerships with sound public policy that ultimately lends to an advantageous competitive posture for the U.S. and our allies in the future? Harnessing inventiveness, imagination, the free flow of ideas to advance prosperity, our national security, and overall quality of life has been core to America's unprecedented success, hand in hand, again, with our partners and allies. This is why we're here today, to examine these questions and more, no small task at hand. But before we get into today's discussion, I'd like to offer the floor to the chairman of the Potomac Institute, General Al Gray.
No, I'll just say, well, welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm going to turn over the speech here to our CEO.
Good afternoon. I apologize for not having a voice. I promise it's not COVID. Thanks everyone for joining us today in person and online for our Global Competition Project public series that we have going on here at the Institute, both for the sake of the Institute and the sake of national security as we try to tackle these topics through discussion. I want to take a moment to remind everybody that not only does the Institute sit at this intersection of business and government to drive policies that are for the country overall, but also that we're a think and do tank, right? So we sit through these conversations with the panelists that we have today to drive to a recommendation that we can start to see implementation and see a change here in this country and globally. So Tim, over to you and your panelists today. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dr. Buss. All right, before we introduce our panel members, and Jen just mentioned it a little bit about the Global Competition Project, but I'm just going to go a little bit deeper briefly. But the project was launched to explore what the United States must do to continue to thrive as a global leader, economically and otherwise, driving toward a societal level understanding and approach to competition at the intersection of policy, industry, and science and technology. To do so, the project is commissioning a spectrum of experts like we have today, we're very lucky to have today, from across diverse fields, from across the Institute's network. Their purpose is to highlight and elevate issues surrounding both the challenges and opportunities associated with societal level competition today and in the future. So what are the greatest vulnerabilities to consider? What's at stake? How do we best leverage our strengths? Ultimately, the project's goal is to develop foundational references through research, discussion, events, and papers, etc., for national security professionals, policymakers, industry leaders, and others as they drive awareness and understanding in how the U.S. might address the most consequential aspects of near-peer competition. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our distinguished panel. First, to the left of me, I'm very happy to introduce a member of our Board of Regents, the Honorable Zach Lemnios, a senior executive with over 40 years experience leading development and application of advanced technologies for national and global security. Zach has served across industry, government, and academia, to include as vice president at IBM Research, 3 terms as a high-level civilian leader in the Department of Defense, including as the Senate-confirmed Assistant Secretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, in other words, the department's Chief Technology Officer, and as the first Chief Technology Officer of MIT Lincoln Labs. So we're very happy to have you with us here today, sir. Next to my right, I'm very honored to introduce Ms. Lois Nicholson, Counselor Defense Acquisition and Technology at the British Embassy here in Washington, D.C. In that role, she leads a team that works with the U.S. on acquisition and trade, research and technology, and future capability development. Ms. Nicholson has over 25 years' experience leading teams in the design of complex military systems across public and private sectors. At the British Embassy, she previously oversaw the UK's research exchange with the US and was later appointed to the Senior Civil Service as the Ministry of Defense's Head of Scrutiny. I love that title. I think that's something that we need in our government too. That's fantastic. Ms. Nicholson also serves as a member of the British Defense Staff Management Board and is an Allied Fellow graduate of the U.S. Capstone Senior Leadership Program. And online, we have joining us Dr. Will Roper. Good to see you, sir. He's the CEO of Volancy, an aerial drone delivery company. He landed there after serving 3 years as Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Acquisitions, Technology, and Logistics. In that role, he led all research, development, procurement, and logistics for the U.S. Air Force and the Space Force. He is known for accelerating acquisition timelines and fostering disruptive innovation inside the government, to include taking large strides in opening defense market opportunities to commercial companies with initiatives like AFWorks and Small Business Innovative Research Reform. Will was a founding director of the Pentagon's Strategic Capabilities Office and also served as principal staff assistant to the Secretary of Defense for Disruption and Innovation. So we're very glad to have such a distinguished panel today, and excited for this discussion and where it leads. So Secretary Lemnios will start by providing a deeper introduction of the issue and a framework for our discussion, captured in a paper he recently wrote, which you should see the QR code, I think, in the chat if you haven't already seen it, titled U.S. National Security and a New Era of Intense Global Competition. So without further ado, I will pass the floor to you, sir, for your opening remarks.
Thanks, Tim. Jen and Admiral Gray, thank you both for, and for the Potomac staff for hosting this. It's a critically important topic. And I can't think of a better venue than the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies to take this on. Lois, it's good to see you again. And Will, it's always good to see you. Miss those conversations in the building, but it's good to see you here. This morning, we all woke to the tragic incursion, the invasion, where Russia has invaded Ukraine. And that's going to have a terrible impact on the population of Ukraine. It's certainly going to have an impact on the financial markets, and it's fundamentally challenging the position of NATO and the European Union in that part of the world. It will have implications on all of us, and it's going to have an impact for quite some time. But as devastating as that is, and as important a topic as that is, the challenge that we face with China is the topic of this meeting largely, and it's the area that I'm most concerned about. It's a subject of the paper that we authored. It's a subject of a whole host of discussions. And I think the great power competition that China and the United States are engaged in is going to have a profound impact on our national security, if not global security, of both countries for many decades. The competition is a little different than the competition that we've seen with other countries, with Russia, with North Korea, with Iran. Because this competition with China is focused on the interdependent connections of economic, military, and political competition. And those all have very different signals. They all have very different engagement points. At the core, this is a competition of governance and of ideals. And we've seen that in other domains before, but this one is much more complicated. I want to just make a few comments up front to kind of set the context. We know that we've seen the military side of the China, U.S. and partner engagements, but there's an economic side that's critically important. China is investing over $2 trillion a year and has done so for the past 8 years in its Belt and Road Initiative. This is an initiative across largely Asia, parts of Africa, and parts of Europe to open new trade channels, new trade corridors. They have spent $4.2 trillion a year on this investment. By comparison, they spend about $250 billion a year on their military investments. So you can see where their focus is. This is almost our entire U.S. federal budget. In 2020, the U.S. budget was just north of $4 trillion. So by comparison, this gives us a sense of where their point of action is. They've invested $33 trillion since 2013 in 139 countries across Southeast Asia to open new trade routes. In fact, last December, they opened a new trade corridor with Laos. In 6 years, a $6 trillion investment to open a high-speed trail link between China and Laos. The investment was largely to open a new trade environment. They have similar investments in industries through their Made in China 2025 initiative. They've been very clear that they want to lead in 10 key high-tech industries. And they've made the investments to lead in those industries. Most recently, we saw investments that China was making in the IT infrastructure with Huawei and similar companies, ZT. But we've also seen more recently investments that China is making in the semiconductor industry, and that's captured a lot of attention. The culmination of all of this and the pressure that the Chinese government, through this military-civil fusion strategy, has placed on the U.S. and our allies is something that's quite unique. And if unaddressed, we're going to be on the wrong side of the equation. So that's really what the paper was that prompted this discussion. I think we'll get into a lot of this today. And I think what the end part of this is thinking through what does the national security framework really need to look like in this environment of multi-level interdependent competition. And Tim, as the first speaker, I have the prerogative of reframing the question a bit. And I'd like to kind of reframe, at least from my perspective, the question from, is a department prepared for a broad spectrum of conflict? Pretty important question. But I'd like to reframe it to, how does the United States and our partners, how do we lead in a sustained environment of great power competition with China? Every one of those words is loaded. But that's the interesting part here. And I would offer there are probably three areas that we might want to focus on. First and foremost, international partnerships are absolutely critical. They're critical for us to understand global markets and for us to gain global insight, partners and the U.S. Second, industrial partnerships are critical for talent, for persistence, and for depth. Well, you spent a good part of your tenure in the department on that topic. And lastly, we need to agree as a community on the long-term target, and we need to execute with speed, with precision, and with agility. General Gray, you made those comments, I think, this morning, and we don't do that very well as a community. We can agree on some targets, but execution speed gets pretty fuzzy. So I would offer that as maybe a way to shape the discussion that we'll have over the next several hours. And again, it's terrific to be here with the team.
Thank you, sir. And Dr. Roper, we're going to go to you next, sir, if you're ready.
Sure thing, Tim, and appreciate the Potomac Institute for keeping a sustained focus on strategic competition. And I really think that as an institute that straddles different parts of government, including the intelligence community, that you're at a unique place to be able to give the government advice about how it avoids dividing and conquering itself and provides a unified front to the challenges we're going to face. Look, I'm going to be very interested in people's questions today, but I have been thinking about the problem of great power competition since I was first given that task over 10 years ago. And it's something that no matter how much I think about, I continue to have new ideas, new thoughts that are challenging how I think about competing, especially with China long term. I think it's very easy to fall into symmetric thinking along the lines of the Cold War. And I've seen that in every day I've been in the Pentagon, a propensity to go back to a playbook that did work for us in the past and salvage and recycle too much of it in a modern day context, even though the modern day doesn't look anything like that Cold War era. And more increasingly, I see the Pentagon moving towards a future where it has a military, maybe one more generation of its military that is capable of beating China in a conflict or any adversary, but losing the competition. And that's increasingly where I worry. Having a military that can win while losing the competition. And I'll explain a little bit what I mean by that, but I would love to hear from the panelists and from questions today about, is this true? And then what can we do to prevent it? I've worried less about the particular threats that we face from any particular military. I think that any challenge that we see in terms of a platform or a ConOps can be overcome with a better platform and a ConOps, but that's not really where the worry lies. I'm more worried about the dividing technology ecosystem in this country. I know Zach mentioned the civilian military fused approach that China has. They're centrally managing all aspects of their nation and are able to avoid having any divide between the private sector, so-called in China, and the military or government. So they truly are able to tap whole of government power. But as you look at one of the greatest national treasures that we have in this nation, which is our burgeoning, growing, energizing tech ecosystem, the way that we do venture capital and grow companies in this country is a huge element of soft power and has led to a great economic advantage for us. It's led to a great talent draw advantage to us. But those technology ecosystems that define themselves under the .com banner have increasingly moved further and further away from the .gov market. I think that's one of the biggest risks that we face. While China is centralizing and managing the competition, we're not only not doing that, we're actually dividing and conquering ourselves, what we're capable of accomplishing. And I see the Pentagon continuing to try to engage the private sector as if it's in the Cold War, putting its funding on the table and thinking that the best and brightest from industry will rally around its problems. And I simply don't see that being the case anymore. Compared to the height of the Cold War, where the US government represented 80%, almost 80% of the total research and development in this nation, we now represent 20% within the government. So it's a complete flip around in terms of who's doing research, who's growing the next generation of technology that's going to change the world. And because of that, the economics simply aren't in our advantage. And so rather than being a purchaser or an inventor of new technology, we're often going to have to be a leverager. We're going to have to take what is coming from the private sector and turn it into capabilities that have relevance on the battlefield. But as I mentioned earlier, if that's all we do, we could still end up having a military that can win and a nation that loses. And so the challenge that I ended up focusing on in the Air Force is how could I use the procurement system I was running, not just to build a better military, but to build a better industrial base that could build better anything, including militaries? How can I use the military as a market, as a strategic stability market that has continued funding, that is able to invest in deep tech and invest patiently, that is a purchaser, so it does represent recurring revenue? How do I use that to give the Air Force the benefit of a next generation industrial base that is not just world leading for building militaries, that is world leading, period? And we created one project called Agility Prime to try to use the military market to accelerate the .com market of vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. I think you can argue that that program worked successfully. We took companies through certification, which was much faster and easier than what would have been possible with the FAA. The first flight certifications were granted by the military, and the private sector responded. They treated this market that used to be called flying cars and now is treated legitimately as a new class of aircraft. They treated it seriously, capital flowed in, and the US is leading this industry for now. I view that as the real battlefield that the Pentagon will have with China. It is not a battle over platforms or CONOPS. It's going to be a battle over the industrial base that creates the next industrial revolution. And if the .mil part of our nation is not engaged, it's simply too much to ask the .com market to not just be world leading in industry, but to give us a world leading military as well. So though we can't do a civilian military fused approach the way China does, we can create a symbiotic relationship between what the government does and the private sector does. And markets have shown themselves to be exceptionally stable and exceptionally proficient in generating sustained innovation over time. So whereas a central system can have single points of failure, markets check and balance themselves. And maybe over the long term, that check and balance is the advantage that we have in this competition. But it starts with being clear-eyed about where the battlefield is. And if we don't start looking at the next industrial base, the next industrial revolution, and what we can do as a nation to ensure it occurs with a US zip code, just like the last one did, then I fear that future sons and daughters will be working at Chinese multinational companies at their equivalent location of Silicon Valley, because they would have successfully won this race to the next industrial base and the next industrial revolution. And the Pentagon is currently not equipped to compete at this level of strategy. But hopefully, with the advice of the Potomac Institute, the panelists, and questions today, maybe a few good ideas will be planted.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate the comments. And over to our partner from the UK, Ms. Lois Nicholson.
Tim, thank you. And General Dr. Buss, Potomac Institute, thank you so much for inviting a Brit here today. I think I represent both the United Kingdom and obviously today represent Europe. And thank you for your opening remarks on that. I'm delighted to be here today and to sit alongside such illustrious and distinguished speakers. Dr. Lemon-Nielsen and I worked together 10 years ago when he was the Assistant Secretary, Undersecretary for Research and Engineering. Dr. Roper, the UK has got good links in with United States Air Force, and between the two of them, they do represent one of the things I want to talk today about, how international collaboration and cooperation can really get to the fight and tackle these challenges that we're talking about today. I'd like to just reflect on three particular areas. One about the strategic context, very topical for today. One about emerging technologies, and then just talk a little bit about collaboration and partnerships, and actually, what are the opportunities, but what are the risks and challenges to those partnerships. So, turning to the strategic imperative, I smiled today. My notes here say there's arguably never been a time in recent history where industrial and international collaboration has been so important. I think that's very seminal for today, but it is a truism. Mr. Lemon-Nielsen, you talked about great power competition. We see the nature of the threats associated with that, but the last 2 years we've all lived with a global pandemic, and that itself has stressed our governments, it's just stressed our industrial bases, and what it has shown through virus, through actually the vaccination process to get away from the virus is, if we come together as international communities, we can actually fight this. But it actually shows how our industrial bases probably don't have the resilience that we thought they had. So from my perspective, collaboration is key for us to deliver on our most pressing capability challenges and also to maintain our technology advantage. But there is some industrial reality to this. I sit here representing the United Kingdom and would say that actually, our supply chains are international. Our industries are intertwined. the US defence primes here have got significant presence in the UK, and the UK's primes have significant presence here. Just to give some facts, in the UK, US companies employ 20,000 people. Here in the US, UK companies employ 77,000 people in 50 states, all except one. And UK funded programs employ over 160,000 people. So our industries are entwined, our militaries are entwined, our governments are entwined. So from my perspective, we should get like-minded allies to work together to make it as easy as possible for our industry to collaborate and to integrate. And that's the key to outpacing the threats that we see, in particular China and Russia. And international forums are important. I'll talk about that in a minute, but they are important both to strengthen our industrial bases, but also to look to ways to reducing barriers. But the key point for me is about maintaining technology advantage. So if we talk about some of those emerging technologies then, we know that the way to tackle global threats is by A, using international collaboration, and B, by looking at what technology can give us. So from a UK perspective, we have the largest defence budget in Europe. The US has the largest defence budget in the world, and this is, if we bring those resources together, surely we can do some really excellent work to outpace the threat. The UK has last year set out its integrated review, which talks to strategic advantage through science and technology, and by that we mean we use science and technology to achieve our other objectives, which includes strengthening our defence and security and also building resilience for our missions across the world. Our Prime Minister Johnson, has set out by 2030 the UK wants to be recognised as a science and technology superpower, around about the third in the world, and having leading edge in critical technologies. And of course, let's not forget the really strong relationship between the UK and the US on technologies. We came together in the Tizard mission in the Second World War, bringing radar technology, amongst other things, to the US to productionise that and to deliver success against the threat in Europe. So we have history in this. And we should nourish those relationships and bring to bear the wealth of scientific and engineering talent that can bring to the peace. But from my perspective, we can talk all about emerging technologies, be they artificial intelligence, be they machine learning, biotechnology, quantum, or whatever. Those are technologies in their own right. We have to look at the ways in which they can solve the capability challenges we are after. And so we have to look at them in that light. What challenges we have to? And Mr. Roper said that just now about bringing those technologies to deliver capability effect. So from my perspective, this is all about capability challenges and mission outcomes and capability edge and not technology edge. We are seeing competition for these critical emerging technologies. We absolutely are. And they are they are in the essence of being part of this strategic competition. So we would need to look to how we protect those technologies. We'd also need to look at how we can focus in on what the critical enablers are to technology. We can have the technologies, but there are some fundamental other things which play their part in that, such as being able to share data, such as having excellent and qualified personnel who can work across our boundaries, protecting technologies and developing international standards so we can actually exploit these technologies to our most pressing ends. If I then just maybe finish off a little bit on what I see as the essence of collaboration and partnership, both opportunities, and there are them, but there are challenges and risks. We have opportunities, partnerships. This morning's news has seen a real binding together of our international partnerships, be that NATO, be that the UK, the US, and the United Nations and other organisations. We've got very strong relationships in the technology and military arenas in the Five Eyes area, and they have been effective over many, many years. The key to getting those organisations to work is to move at pace. Dr. Roper talked about that just now. For the military in particular, one thing we can do to make sure they operate at pace and relevance is to make sure we concentrate on shared requirements and being able to bring those requirements to bear for our technologies to solve. Of course, in the industrial base as well, we have the importance of close technology collaboration. For the UK, the F-35 is a very strong programme for us. The UK is involved quite significantly in the F-35 programme. We have 15% of every one of those aircraft has 15% UK content, with proud, long heritage companies such as BAE Systems, MBDA for the weapons, Rolls-Royce for the lift system, Martin Baker for the ejection seats. And those companies, more than 100 companies, contribute to that fantastic aircraft, which we see is protecting our shores right now. We also see from US government the extension of the US industrial base through the National Technology Industrial Base to include Australia, Canada and the UK. And that is doing great work as well, looking at ways in which we can protect technologies, looking at ways in which we can define and mitigate against hostile investment threats, and looking at ways in which we can reduce barriers. And just this morning, the DoD produced a paper on resilience in the supply chain, and it's worth a look. And that talks about how we can work together both across the US interagency process, but also with allies to look at resilience in the supply chain. There are some challenges, though. There are some challenges with all of this. One thing, and Dr. Roper talked about it just now, is have we got agility in the way we acquire things? Have we got the imagination to capture the emerging technologies in the right sort of way? Have we got the imagination to capture those companies, to work alongside the dedicated primes and existing primes so we can get that technology, that really fantastic technology, into the hands of the user? Something we can discuss. There are some regulatory barriers for those of us who are not US domiciled. I will talk on one, that is US export controls. We all want to protect our technologies. The UK has its own export control policy, but for many who sit outside the US, US export controls themselves are a barrier. We are doing some fantastic work with the administration to look at reducing those barriers, but I'm pretty sure there's more we can do so that our technologists who live in the UK, live in Europe, and live here in the US can work together to solve problems. You'll find that US companies and UK companies who straddle the Atlantic, for example, Lockheed Martin, BAE Systems, Rolls-Royce, are finding it tough to deploy their whole talent onto problems because of export controls and the fear that their technologies, if those people work on it, will become ITAR tainted. So a real challenge there. I think there's a couple of other things I'd point out as well though. I think I've just talked about supply chain resilience, and I've talked about how the US has identified where those critical points are. The UK is doing that too. But there is something here in the US about protectionism. The UK itself recognises and supports the necessity for all our nations to strengthen and secure our industrial base and our critical supply chains. And we've recognised that in our own defence, industrial and security strategy. But it's neither practical or feasible to isolate the US's industrial base from the UK and our closest allies. And what we're seeing through legislation which touches on that, such as Buy America, it tries to focus in on the US. And we believe, and we've heard good words from congressional colleagues talking about allied shoring, so making sure that the UK, alongside other allied nations, is part of that industrial base. Final thing I would say is, adversary investment in some of our niche technology areas. It is a risk, and the UK has been taking steps, as the US has, to protect our key technologies from adversarial investment. Just a couple of months ago, the UK strengthened its provisions through our National Security and Investment Act, which allows us to act more stringently against and with more flexible powers against adversarial investment. And we are doing that in the same way as CFIUS, and that will allow us to intervene where we see investments are acting against what we regard as our critical national security technologies and companies. I think I'll leave it there, and I've touched on a range of things, and I'm looking forward to a really strong discussion in the next hour or so. So back to you, Jim.
Yes, thank you. A lot to chew on there. Thank you very much from our panelists. Just for the audience, please, if you have a question, put it in the chat, and we'll make sure that we bring those up. However, I'm going to start off with the question since I have the honor sitting in the middle here of this discussion, and I'm going to move from the last thing that you were just talking about, and hopefully this can be a discussion between all of us here, because all of you actually hit on this to a certain extent, but that adversarial investment in our economy in various ways, which China has cornered the market on some certain technologies, or Dr. Roper mentioned Agility Prime and our ability to get ahead in that regard in one area. But really, at the end of the day, those adversarial investments are predatory economic practices, the DoD doesn't necessarily, I think, see this as something that's their problem necessarily. Today they still think of traditional platforms. You look at how the defense budget is set up and how it's incentivized. The NDAA is very rigid and structured, and we're getting away a little bit from that. But my question to you all is dealing with adversarial investment that really impacts the DoD's ability to provide combat power in a kinetic sense, right, and work with our allies and partners to do the same. Is that an operational mission that the DoD should be thinking about, especially when it comes to them being able to create combat power or the traditional missions that they carry out? Is that something that they should be invested in, given where we're at in the world? So, sir, I'll start with you.
I happen to be the nearest neighbor, I guess. So let me unpack that a little bit, at least as I'm hearing it. I see two very distinct challenges. There's one challenge around how should the department structure a defense industrial base to include all elements, not just the traditionals, but a whole bunch of others, with partners to get the best technology into a set of capabilities as an overmatch to our adversaries. Some of those words are packed with subtleties. Well, you did a lot of that, and a lot of that worked really well, and I think a lot of that was challenged by how do you do that at scale, and how do you do that as a matter of course, not as a matter of a one-off special. How do you do that as a trade craft? So there's a body of work around that. And I'm of the opinion that the traditional defense industrial base is interesting, but it's not complete. And I think a lot of folks are sort of looking at it. How do we strengthen that base to include more ideas, rapid turns of innovation, best ideas at an affordable cost to deliver capabilities to our warfighters across a broad domain of conflict? Part A. Part B, I think, is a much bigger challenge. And that challenge is, how does this nation compete economically in a global environment of which the Defense Department might be a few percent? It's an important few percent, but it's not the 90%. How does industry compete in a global environment to include policy levers, to include economic incentives, to include all sorts of things, when industry now is global? Everybody in this room has an iPhone or a Samsung phone. This supply chain is in China, and Apple has engineered it to be in China for very good reason. So how do we actually operate as a global set of enterprises in a competitive way. And that's the second piece, and that's kind of where I started. I think this first one is absolutely critical. If you don't get that right, you've got other problems. But you got to get both right. So I didn't answer your question, but I'm formulating sort of a set of topics that I think are both critically important.
Dr. Roper, how about you? What are your thoughts on operationalizing, protecting and defending our supply chains that lead to mission capability or other things?
Well, Tim, I hoped that COVID would teach the department and the U.S. government a more strategic lesson about supply chain and the fragility of the things that keep the nation ready. And I'm not sure that it did, but let me respond a little bit to your adversarial investment insight. I think it's indicative of a bigger problem that the U.S. government has, that the Pentagon has, and that the lines of conflict have moved so far left that by the time you get to kinetics, the war is likely over. And we've seen that now played out in reality in Europe just this week. I think that is increasingly going to be true. It will be necessary to have kinetic capabilities. It will be nice to have fighter jets, but we could easily have the world's best fighter, or the world's best aircraft carrier, the world's best submarine, the world's best satellite, and lose because the conflict is far left of them. And the challenge that I see the US government facing is the division of all of the titles of authority. And most people who have served in government, who have been in the intelligence community or have been on counterintelligence have had the experience of something bad happening where the US government was not able to respond because of a division of title authority. And I think that is going to be increasingly a bigger problem, that what Title 10 does will be insufficient if we don't combine it with Title 50 and with law enforcement and counterintelligence, because China doesn't have that divide. They're one entity. They use all aspects of their power, including lawfare and engagement and coercion, to great effect. Now, I'm not proposing we go into coercion, but I do think there is a lesson to be learned from China in that if you want to wield whole of government power, you organize for it. We're not organized for it. So your insight that China's now invested in our supply chain, they've invested in our economy, everyone knows that. They've invested significantly in strategic real estate. They've even invested in our educational system. They are moving the conflict so far left of where the Pentagon begins thinking. And I've sat many times in war games where we begin in with the day we mobilize for war. And in my view, increasingly, that is where the war game will end. And everything interesting, everything that will provide advantage and dominance will happen to the left. And we're just not ready for that. And it's exactly the fragility we have seen with COVID, that same fragility we would see in an actual conflict with a peer competitor, especially if it's China, because of the soft power benefits of moving the leading edge of the conflict to the left, including having strategic influence over raw material and supply chain. And I'm wondering, when is the Pentagon going to do that war game? The war game that ends where traditional war games typically begin.
That is a great question. When is that war game? Absolutely. And with that, I'd hand it over to Lois.
That's a bit of a tricky place to continue the conversation, Will. Thank you for that. I think what I would say is a couple of things. Just on your point about adversarial capital and what the Pentagon is doing, I think what we're seeing from our involvement and inclusion in the National Technology Industrial Base with the DoD and Industrial Base Policy Team is we are having really good conversations on supply chains. And the report this morning, I do have the number, I can tell you what it is. 14 Executive Order 14017, it's the 1-year report on that. So there is work there which looks at where the vulnerabilities are in the supply chain to make sure that we take action on that collectively. It recognises the role of allies and partners in that. So that's one good thing. Also, as part of NTIB, we've been looking at adversarial investments and looking at how doing wargaming to a certain extent are the sorts of things we were saying there about looking at between our nations, the 4 nations, how we could actually get after adversarial investment using the authorities in each of our countries. We have different authorities. The UK has just strengthened ours with the National Security and Investment Act, but we have actually looked at, if X and Y are happening, sharing what we know, sort of horizon scanning and looking at how we can actually get after this. So, it's not all about solving, in my view, the whole of the Belt and Road Initiative, but there are ways in which we can get after some of this for things that actually matter to us for national security.
So let me follow up on again, context is important, and so the question is, why aren't we doing it? Like, what are the barriers? What are the barriers for government industrial partnerships? That is contracts, that is dollars. What are the barriers? Well, there are a couple things. From my experience, industry and government, the incentives aren't aligned. Simply aren't. The level of risk isn't aligned. It's going to be hard for industry to take on a high-risk topic unless they're reimbursed for it in some way that shows near-term revenue. Risk levels are an issue. Financial incentives aren't aligned in many, many cases. And most recently, we're starting to see that talent isn't aligned. So you can find point solutions for all of these, right? It's great to say broadly this is what's happening. You can find point solutions, and I think there are exemplars where elements of each of those has been closed to some measure. But the incentives piece, my experience is that's a big one. Understanding how much risk is industry willing to take on, under what incentives, to be in it for the long game, not just for the one contract, but for the whole, you're in it for a partnership. A partnership is a long engagement. And those are always points of tension. Will, I'm sure you saw that in your engagement. I suspect you're seeing it now in your current role. You're probably, I'm guessing, you're a pretty risky guy, you're a pretty sharp guy, but I'm guessing you're pretty careful about the risk you take on because you've got the responsibility as a CEO for an organization that you want to nurture and drive forward. And so it's, for government to take that on, you sort of need to government folks need to understand who are they dealing with? Like, what's the negotiation actually look like? And I think the department's come a long way to try to understand that. Building folks in the acquisition supply chain that understand what the narrative dialogue with an industrial partner needs to look like. I would say a dozen years ago, it wasn't quite the same. Now that it's become far more complex for a lot of reasons. But those points of alignment are critical. I know that, my experience in industry, strategic partnerships don't just happen. They happen because things are aligned on a number of levels. And by the way, they break apart because particular issues can't be resolved. And clarity is really important.
Right. Before we continue, I'm just going to note that for those of us that are here in the room, Mike Montgomery will have the microphone. I'm going to ask one more question and then just get his attention if you'd like. And also, again, we're taking questions from online too, and we'll do that in just a minute. But to follow up what you just said, Zach, and to follow up actually what all three of you hit on to a certain extent. First of all, thank you for the lines of authority in crossing those. That point of it's inherent in Congress too, unfortunately, that those separations, right, of authorities. That's, you look at the committees in Congress and how they're organized, and unfortunately, that's where those changes have to come is across those lines in those committees and giving up certain authorities and responsibilities to other committees, and that means giving up power, which we know is a difficult thing in this city, let alone collaboration on that front. So, but to follow up what you just mentioned on, and Will hit on it a little bit, and this is a question that was posed from our audience before the event started. does government already have the necessary mechanisms and tools to partner with industry at the pace and flexibility required to meet contemporary and future national security requirements? If so, how might they be better employed? What can the government do to better industry relations? And specifically, to your point about incentives, what are some of those unique incentives that the government has? And I think Dr. Roper mentioned, one of them. Hey, we're going to get this Agility Prime airplane, flying car through the FAA process quicker. That's a unique thing that the government can provide, right? Is to waive those barriers. What are some of? Do we have the tools to do it better? And if not, what's stopping us from using those? Because those are some of the things that stop businesses from even trying to do trying to work with the government on these kinds of fronts. Dr. Roper, how about we start with you on that one?
We don't, but it's not as bad as people think. And the biggest impediment, in my experience, is the budgeting process. It's not the contracting system. It's not the federal acquisition regulations. It's actually, you can almost do anything you want, is what I found. If you really use the regulations, you can run anything you want through them, as long as you use good common sense and fairness. But that's a lot of what I hear people talk about in Washington is acquisition reform. I would love to see budget reform. I think it's the biggest impediment right now to working with industry, because the budget's made 2 years in advance. And although we talk about government organizations as one thing, like the U.S. Air Force, the U.S. Navy, the CIA, they're really, no organization is actually one thing from a budget standpoint, because Congress puts the money into little budget prison called program elements. And each program element is a little prison for that money. And sometimes it has a color associated to it, which makes it even more restrictive for what you can spend it on. And what that did to the U.S. Air Force is took the greatest Air Force and turned it into 550 little Air Forces inside those little lines of accounting. And those lines of accounting provide the ability for people on the Hill to, I get it, to have a micro scope up to what we spend money on, but it waters down our purchasing power. And because the money's allocated 2 years in advance, 2 years is an eternity in the private sector. And that is, in my experience, the biggest impediment that is keeping startups from working effectively with the US government, and I think other governments, is that the pace at which they generate ideas, the pace at which they can prototype and build, it falls inside of that 2 year window. By the time those 2 years go by, that company may not even be there anymore. So until the money side of the government is as responsive as the ideas and the ecosystem require, there'll be an impedance mismatch between the two. Now, there are things that you can do to hack the system in the near term, and we did some of those in the Air Force, doing, pitch days and things like that. We used government credit cards to pay people immediately. You can hack the system like that, but they're ugly hacks. What would be fantastic is to have a completely different budgeting system put together with the intent of not just building a more competitive military, working with allies and partners, working with commercial companies, but actually using it to build a more competitive industrial base, period. The strategic role that militaries will play in the economies of leading countries in this century will be as the first adopters of deep tech. So I would like to see a budgeting process that allows the Pentagon to use its strategic role as the first adopter of deep tech, very similar to what it did on Agility Prime, but doing that for myriad fields of technology that will be used by militaries before they will be used by private citizens. And when we start thinking that way, we'll be on the real battlefield. The real battlefield is for the next generation of technology, and whoever wins that battle will build an awesome military with it. And whoever doesn't win that battle is not going to have access to the raw material to build the military it needs. And I view the way that we do business now is we're trying to build a better version of what we've had in the past with the same companies who built it in the past. And what has it led to? Massive consolidation of the defense industrial base. So the thing I've just gone through would actually, hopefully, grow the industrial base, but not grow it in the image of the one that we had in the past. It would grow it in a new image, one where companies really aren't defense companies, they're just tech companies, and they do business with governments, and they do business with the private sector. If we don't get that model right, then we'll be stuck with yesterday's military and today's world.
So you're putting all your eggs into the basket, along with the PPBE commission that they just came out with. They just started naming members for that commission that came out per the mandate of the 2022 NDAA. Any faith in that coming up with some changes that?
I've spent significant time with members of Congress helping them understand how much of a hobgoblin the budgeting process is in preventing innovation. There are other things I'd like to see done, but look, let's be specific and laser focused. That's the first thing I'd like to see changed. If we change that, then that impedance mismatch between our money and the speed of ideas in the private sector will be significantly reduced. Doesn't mean that the problem will be fixed. You have to have the culture and the willingness and the risk taking in the government to use that impedance, the lack of an impedance mismatch to advantage. A lot of issues there, but hey, progress in government is moving to better problems. So right now we got a problem that our money's too slow. Let's move to a better problem where our money isn't too slow, but we've got the wrong people and the wrong training and the wrong culture to really unleash our potential.
Thank you, sir. What do you think from your frame and where you sit as far as incentives go? And what are they similar challenges, similar discussions that you're hearing from your side that from your experience?
I think that, Tim, is yes and no. I think the UK budgeting system is much more flexible than the PB&E here. I would say we do have to control government money and look where it goes, but the individual service chiefs have a mandate to be able to take in their command plan. They will lay out what they want to do, and then they will be able to veer and haul to be able to deliver that. There's some really, really good work going on within the Navy at the moment and within the Air Force, looking at actually, what do we need? The UK has just laid out and its first aircraft carrier has gone on its global voyage and global deployment. But we're also looking at, for example, about what we can use those flight decks for, and there's some really good innovative work going on with various levels of drones and various other things that you could deploy off a flat deck, as well as the very capable F-35. So, and that is looking at budgeting, using the budget we have and using it in a different way to get after some of those issues and get after the issues of technology, getting into the hands of the user quicker, getting to the fight quicker, but also at lower cost. So a lot of work going on in that space. I think what I would say is, yes, we do have acquisition paths which traditionally have been very long-winded. Like the US, we are looking at ways of getting at that, getting at early technologies. We have our Defence and Security Accelerator being one of those vehicles we use. That's been set up for about 5 years. We've pumped in $250 million into it. We've had over 5,000 call companies responding to calls and over 1,000 companies actually being given money to develop their tech. So I think there's it's a problem. It will remain a problem. But I think in the UK we don't have quite as rigid sort of yearly windows to do these prisms that Will was talking about.
Are there tunnels of communication open between our two countries, that we're able to share and learn from each other?
Yeah, we do. Yeah. The UK, for example, our Royal Air Force has set up a rapid capabilities office, very much along the lines of the US Air Force, to try and get at some of these technology issues and getting that responding very quickly, going in a slightly sort of different route to standard acquisition and getting after those technologies and getting that into product. But there's more to be done. There always is more to be done.
Sure.
Technology cycles, it's the speed of relevance. What is, in building an aircraft carrier or a new submarine, that is decades worth of engineering and resource and development. Getting after, an AI algorithm on a smartphone is in hours, not decades.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to start with a question here in the room. So, Sam, if you don't mind introducing yourself and go ahead and with your question.
Hi everyone, I'm Samantha Wilkinson with Potomac, and I have questions for the panel. Mostly on as far as getting at the partnerships and long-term targets. I wondered about how we came through the pandemic, and in the beginning it seemed like most countries they became more into themselves, like they kind of were more survivalists of basically conserving their materials for their population, and as things get better and vaccines were made, then perhaps then there were more distributions of it to other countries. I guess what I'm saying when it comes to like partnerships there and good faith and having that kind of strategic stability, you saw maybe like a not the best distribution when it comes to that sort of thing. And presence in other countries of the world, showing that you guys are leading, UK and the US, when it comes to being a leader in innovation, medicine, and these things. And so I don't know if there's going to be defense-wise. I think that is it's lacking there, because I don't know if you're supposed to suddenly be great in defense when it came to logistics, which is what defense is really good at. And it didn't really come across when it came to in the moment all of a sudden. Secondly, when it comes to the whole, say for instance, protecting technology, for our Power Astronaut study, you came across dual use technology for good, where you can use something for two purposes, and dual use technology where other countries can take it and use it against the country. And how UK and the US has come together and started a committee, and they met for the first time last year. And I guess I would love an idea when it comes to protecting and going through your committee, the UK and the US, the process of making that, I guess, not another barrier. And also, if it's for protection, is it also for dual use for good, like to build something more for partnerships and building better industry around the world. So that's about it.
Thank you, Sam. And so dual-use technology is obviously a big question to ask about, given the dynamic or given the discussion that we're having. So, and again, supply chain vulnerabilities and partnerships there. And I'm going to start with you, sir, if you'd like to take a stab
Sure.
at that.
So the supply chain topic has been front and center pre-pandemic, and it has several flavors. Right? The department wants a secure supply chain. It wants a trusted supply chain. It wants an assured supply chain. All those words are loaded. During the pandemic and today, we hear the automotive sector saying they can't deliver vehicles because they don't have microchips. It's a supply chain issue. Let's take a look back. Over the past 10 years, the automotive sector in particular, and other industries as well, have built these tightly bound supply chains, just-in-time supply chains, because you don't want to incur the carrying cost of supplies that are in transit. You want those parts to be available on the assembly line when they're needed, not an hour sooner, not 2 hours sooner. And we're now in an environment where there's disruption and you need agility, and agility carries cost. If you want to have an agile supply chain, you're going to have to carry the cost of supporting those goods at some time when they're not being used. Well, to date, that's not how at least the automotive sector has engineered their supply chains. I've worked at Ford for a number of years. So this is something that I think we need to look at carefully. The department has its particular challenges in terms of how do I assure that the end article that I've contracted for does exactly what it's supposed to do, no more, no less, today and forever. And how do I update it at some cost that I can predict and I can pre-negotiate? All those have different features. So I would say that on the supply chain topic, what we're seeing now, certainly a challenge, and certainly a set of changes that are underway, but not terribly surprising. If I looked at what was happening in the automotive sector, and the travel sector is a great one, right? So if you look at, tell me, how were Airbus and Boeing orders a year ago? Well, air travel wasn't going so well, right? So those companies kind of cut back on their future. A lot of those orders are kind of in waiting, but those orders were in flight, no pun, but they weren't hard orders. And all of a sudden, there are projections as to how is travel going to come back, and that's going to influence how these companies negotiate with their strategic partners. A lot of this comes back to, I think, Will, you mentioned it, I've talked about it, I've written about it, the precision of forecasting. What might the future look like? And I'll say forecasting, not predicting. The ability to understand an environment, more than just the military environment, understand the economic environment that you're in, that you're competing in, and how do you lay out the chess pieces? What bets are you willing to make, and with what precision? And I would say that many of those tools broadly don't quite exist. Leading companies have those tools in spades, and they compete very well. Companies know their competitors. They know them through understandings of mergers and acquisitions. They read the open source financial reports. You know who's leading the company. You know who the people are that are developing products. You build a model of a company. But I would say that on the broader economic topic of how does the U.S. and how do we as U.S. and partners compete globally, that tradecraft really isn't in play. It doesn't exist. It exists in small pockets, but it's not part of our day-to-day game plan. And so that's the supply chain piece is one part of it, but there are many other parts, and it's a pretty complicated problem that needs a little bit of work.
So who should lead that effort, or who in the government or industry or some partnership? Who should be the leader in bringing that market intelligence, if you will, for lack of a better term, together to provide a framework?
So I want to hear from the group, but I would think Commerce would be pretty interested in that. I would think U.S. Trade would be pretty interested in that. The Treasury might be interested in that. I would think the administration broadly would want to have some measure of how do we compete globally. Not just militarily, but how do we compete as a nation globally? And how do we engage with our partners to help them compete? And how do we compete as a partnership? Those are all critical questions.
Will, Lois, how about your thoughts on that front?
Yeah, Tim, my view is I think we learned from COVID. It's an actual vignette for what future conflicts are going to do to us and our current organization and government. I still try to forget those first couple of weeks where there was no real playbook for how to keep the military ready to go to war when states were shutting things down. And I mean, it was really clear this was a different kind of this needed a different kind of war plan, in quotes, and we didn't have one. And so we had to do our best making one up on the fly. And just due to amazing men and women in the Air Force, there wasn't a day where readiness wasn't maintained. But as I participated with the rest of the government, because I have the Defense Production Act under me in the Air Force, it was very clear that the organizations that were on paper responsible for the more strategic aspects of the response do not have the people, the personnel, in some cases even the business functions to respond at scale, right? FEMA was able to respond to local disasters, but not a disaster at scale. Commerce that we worked with on the Defense Production Act, very few people. And so it's really only the military that has the staff and the execution engine to do anything in the government at scale. But yet we hadn't determined what would the military's role be in a national pandemic. And although it did play an important role, it could have played a much more potent one. I think I think that is going to be the case for these gray zone competitions or future pandemics, future catastrophes that don't really fall into a military mobilization model, but where only the military has the engine to mobilize and do something at scale. And without thinking ahead as to how are we going to organize in the government differently, what roles and responsibilities will be assigned, do we have to change organizations, scale them? Do we shrink others back? Then I think the same level of flat-footedness that happened early in COVID will happen again for whatever new challenge appears in future that doesn't really fit into a traditional military scenario. And I hoped, I even thought during COVID, we're going to learn something out of this. We're going to come out of this and there's going to be a mandate that we start looking at contingencies not covered by our current planning. And to my knowledge, that hasn't happened yet. And it really needs to. It's time for, a 21st century model for government and to get out of the 20th century one that worked well, helped us win the Cold War and build a great economy, leading industry. But today's world's different. And I think the model of government should change too.
So, Will, on that front, just something that I've been talking about with some colleagues, and you're probably exposed to in your time in the Pentagon, is what do our reserve component members have to give somebody that works in the financial markets, for example, for their day job, if you will, and then their weekend job, they're doing something, they have that strategic operational mind, right? And where can we leverage that kind of experience together to get the human capital that we need to think about such things? Because resident, in what we do day to day in the Pentagon, like you're saying, I think is that's not resident in day to day thinking or experience wise. Is that an avenue that we can go down? Is there something there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the reserve, and I would say the Guard as well, are kind of magical, right? You think about how hard it is to get into government and all the conflict of interest stuff that we have to deal with and the revolving door pejorative. But we have, hundreds of thousands of men and women that go back and forth from the private sector into service all the time, bringing the experience both ways. And, we're still using that for pretty like yesterday means, right? We're getting extra pilots or extra medics or extra whatever. But I think it could increasingly be used to get the highly valued skill sets in STEM and AI and data analytics that are just going to be difficult to hire into the government, and probably doesn't make sense to hire them permanently because those skills need to be refreshed in the private sector that's driving them. And I was even an advocate. I tried with a few members of Congress to get the idea of a civilian guard so that you could have that same ability to go in and out, to have the equivalent capability for civilians, so that people who feel patriotic but that don't want to serve a career in government, but are willing to put their time on the table, and the companies they work for are willing to let their time be on the table, that we start bringing all of our talent together in something that feels more like a whole of nation approach. It's just one example of we have to think differently in this century. Talent's changed. The technologies we need are changed. They're going to be outsourced to the private sector. So how does the government turn itself inside out so that it's more responsive to the world in which it lives?
Thanks. And I'm going to shift to Sam's other question here really quick and ask you, Lois, to if you'd like to weigh in on that, the dual use technologies. Where are the opportunities? Where do those lie? And obviously Will's in the middle of that, having transitioned into the private sector, but we're and focused on the technology. He's focused on the flying cars, if you will. What are some of the other opportunities that you see that you've been working on?
So yeah, I mean, it's back to dual-use technologies existing, obviously AI, quantum, biotechnology, and all of those sort of things. And across our governments, across industry, those are being developed at pace. But for me, they can develop at pace. But for me, it's all about how do we, for military capabilities, how do we exploit those, and what do we exploit them against? You have to have a capability gap that you want to fill. This, as I've said in my opening remarks, this is about capability edge or military edge, not about technology edge. We are not here to get the next iPhone into the hands of the user per se. What we are here to is get the power of that iPhone to tackle a problem that our military would have. So I think Will talked earlier on about incentives. There's a different incentive. And for some of these technologies, quantum being an example, AI being an example, there are specifics that the military will need to exploit those for. That will be a niche piece, but of course we want to encourage the industrial base to work on all those. The UK has a national quantum programme, of which defence plays a part, but we will also execute quantum technologies which are important for defence purposes, which will be absolutely niche and specific and build on that national quantum programme. There's similarity for high speed vehicles. We will use some of that technology to prosecute a weaponised piece, but the overall high speed will remain. And similarly in climate technologies, biofuels and all those sort of things, they will reap significant benefit for the aviation sector, for example, but also we will be able to exploit it in a defence sector too. So I think for me it's all about what challenge do we want to fill, and how can those technologies fill, and also to be able to exploit the technologies which are being developed in a more comprehensive field for more broader applications.
Excellent. So I'm going to call now on Tim Bumpus from the back of the room here. He's graciously offered his services to read some of the questions that we have that's come over the chat. Tim, do you have some of those questions teed up?
Sure. And I won't bother to use this if we're not connected to the internet. So, capitalizing on current events, if China intervenes in the Russo-Ukrainian conflict, what will be the U.S. response to such an intervention, and what are the likely effects in a retaliation of sanctions to be in that spiral?
Anyone you want to take that one on, sir?
This is the problem, right?
Yep.
The problem, two-player games are very different. Three-player games are very different than two-player games. And a three-layer chess game is very different than a single-layer chess game. And that's what we're up against. And we can solve, I'm perplexed a little bit, because we can address the challenges to build a set of military capabilities that allow the U.S. and our allies to prevail. I'm convinced we can do that. We're sort of doing that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to prevail in economic competition with China over the next decade. Okay, so we do all this stuff. We have small businesses. We have lots of, we change our budgeting process. We change our contractual process. We put good leaders everywhere. We build partnerships with industry to build defense products. We try to convince industry to pivot their commercial products to the defense sector, and to do so without losing the opportunity costs that they would realize in higher profit margins elsewhere. Little subtlety. But okay, let's say we do all that. Does that guarantee that we will prevail in an economic competition with China? And my assertion is no. And so I could be wrong. I could be absolutely wrong. I think I'm probably incomplete, but I don't think I'm wrong. But what I'm perplexed with is how do we think through the relationship of the government and the private sector to open up avenues of engagement for the private sector to prevail in its business, and as an avenue, provide the best of technologies to the military where it needs keen technologies. It seems to me that's the problem today. And I'm not sure we're quite there yet. It's a lot of homework.
Would you like to weigh in on this one?
But
I'm sorry.
It's just a point of view.
I think it would be unfair of me to comment on US position, but what I would say is, in all of this, there's an element of competition, there's an element of cooperation, and there's an element of, I can't think what the other C is, but protection.
Yeah.
And I think we have to, have to work out how we promote our industries, how we support those industries, but at the time we want to how we protect those technologies. And there's a balance between national security and economic security in each of those.
It's a tricky dribble, and it's also, we're trying to understand, and we'll figure this out. What are the levers that would advantage us? How do we think through the policy implications, the whole set of legal implications? In the US and the UK, there are also implications on the use of public funds. Fair and open competition is pretty important. So those are the elements that we have, right? And so how do we actually, we mentioned this morning. I go back to the Vannevar-Bush paper, which was sort of the first paper to think through the national strategy for national security. How should the government engage with the private sector in solving our nation's most critical problems right after World War II? And there were 4 points that were made. The third point was how should the government work with the private sector through public-private partnerships to encourage innovation and to bring the best ideas forward. The fourth topic was how do we train a generation of scientists and engineers to, again, have economic and societal impact in the U.S.
So actually building on what you just mentioned, how do we have access, and how do we build that talented workforce that we need? Do we have access to them? Are we heading in the right direction from an education standpoint? Do we have the right collaborations going on? Obviously, and it was brought up earlier, there's China has invested in the West with regard to being in academia, right, and providing grants and money and such into the university system here in the United States. I'm not sure what it's like in the UK, but to that end, we train our adversaries or our rivals, if you will, and then they go back and use that knowledge to compete, right? To gain an advantage. What do we need to do better as far as, do we have access first of all to the right talent, and if not, what are some of the things we can do better to that end, especially on the security front, economic front?
Yeah,
Can I have a quick go at that? So back to the question a bit earlier on about COVID and supply chains and vaccinations. For me, one of the dividends of COVID, and it has been a really difficult 2 years for all of us, right across the globe, personally, professionally, internationally, industrially. But putting that aside, I think one bright light for me is a emergence of people wanting to work in STEM-related products and community, right from school days to people changing their careers because they have seen how the miracle of vaccines has changed our ability to get over this pandemic. So if that is the case, and from a UK perspective, also looking at our integrated review, strategic advantage through science and technology. We are investing more in science and technology to get after the problems. You know, we've got 6.6 billion pounds to spend in 4 years getting after some of those critical problems. We have an amazing chief scientific advisor, our chief scientist in the UK. She's called Dame Angela McLean. She has acted as the MOD's chief scientific advisor, but she has also acted as the government's deputy chief scientific advisor throughout this pandemic. So she's been dealing with COVID and standing on the national briefings like Dr. Fauci has, as well as revolutionising the UK MOD in terms of its response on science and technology. And she's laid out 5 challenges, and one of those happens to be grey zone, one of them happens to be kinetic effects, one happens to be logistics, freedom of action. And that is getting at both the longer term science and technology piece to get that technology, our early science technology into play, but also looking at how we can experiment with the technology we have to get this early technology back into the hands of the user. So, for me, resources, for me, STEM is now at the forefront of many people, and we have money, certainly in the UK, and I know the US will have too, to invest in science and technology to really get after those problems. So for me, with a long career in defence, now is a good time. COVID has been really tragic for many of us, but science and technology is at the forefront, and we should exploit that.
Well, thanks for getting back online with us. Sorry we dropped. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear us okay? Okay, perfect. I'm going to go next to one of our interns. She's a graduate student at Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, and she's going to come up on camera, I think, to ask a question. She's a second lieutenant in the Air Force. She's doing grad school after being at the Air Force Academy, and really happy to have her join us today. And Jessica, it looks like you're up, and pleased to have you, and go ahead with your question.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, panelists. It's been wonderful to listen in and hear everything you've had to say. As he said, I am a second lieutenant, so I kind of represent that current active duty and that upcoming generation that we talked a little bit about. And earlier, Dr. Roper, you said something about how we are a nation that loses, or we could be a nation that loses, but have a military that wins. So we've started to talk about the economic challenges between the private sector and the government, / the military, and strategic competition. And we also talked about the need to push military into a non-traditional role in the government. However, it's also come up a few times throughout this discussion that we're a democracy and our model of government can't quite compete with China's authoritarian style of government when it comes to civilian military interactions. So we talked a little bit about the reservist and the guards role and how we could use those to maybe change the non-traditional role of the military, but specifically looking at active duty. I want to ask a question about how the U.S. civilian military dynamics need to change as we move into the gray zone, specifically focusing on the culture and environment associated with risk-taking and cooperation between the DoD and the private sector, and how we can set ourselves up to be more than just a military that wins, but also a nation that wins.
Thanks, Jess. That's a great question. The civ-mil relations, which are challenging, I think, that's something that every nation deals with, I think, a little bit differently. Anyone want to take a first crack at that?
Well, Jen, let me offer the following, and I want to come back to Lois, one of the points that she made, the STEM point that she made. I was at a National Academy meeting last week. And one of the things that we looked at, one of the conclusions that we came to, one of the observations that we made, the American public has very little understanding of, I'll call it the scientific enterprise. Simply doesn't understand it. It's hard for us to convey it. It's hard for us to convey scientific results to the general public because we all like to polish the 4th and 5th digit, and the U.S. public sort of doesn't understand it. The pandemic forced us to understand it. We learned a new lexicon, we learned a new language, we started to understand a little bit of statistics, but a lot of people questioned a lot of things. And I think there are two things that are kind of needed here, and I think we're on a path, but we're not there yet by any means. The first is educating a generation to appreciate science and engineering on the merits. And you've done that, you're doing that in your career, right? You are in your spot because it kind of attracted you, I suspect. And yet that's not the norm just yet. I think we're a lot better on that point today than we were a decade ago. We got a long way to go. The other piece, and the harder piece, is being able to convey scientific challenges or engineering challenges to the general public in a way that kind of inspires and, to the points made earlier, encourages new thinking. And on that, I think we're pretty far. I think we're pretty short of the goal line for a lot of reasons. Companies are unwilling, for good reason, to expose a lot of their results for competitive purposes, for competitive reasons. But I think this notion of how do you educate the public to both appreciate the opportunity and to understand the threat, and to in fact bring solutions to the table, or bring, in your case, a commitment to the table, critically important.
So, Will, you got to work with a lot of younger officers with AFWorks and other initiatives that you helped lead and guide in the Pentagon. How do you respond to Jessica's question from that front?
Well, first of all, Jessica, the fact that you're serving, it does give me a little more hope for our future. As long as we continue to have bright people who see national security as a place to spend their careers, we've got a fighting chance. So thank you for your service. Look, spending time with sharp, motivated, clear-eyed officers is the best part of the Air Force job. I miss it every day. I think the answer to your question is it's very insightful that the role of the military ought to change in this century. We went through last century with the need for militaries that could mobilize for massively scaled world wars. We transitioned from that into a Cold War, which is a very different kind of competition, more developmental in nature, certainly posturing deployment developmental. And we ended dealing with violent extremism. So 3 very different challenges in one century. And I think in this century, it's going to be those problems that are to the left. The interconnectedness of the world, the interconnectedness of our supply chain, things like pandemics and biologics that have been talked about, have been written about. There have been science fiction movies made about for decades, but it became science fact with COVID. And the model that we created a military around, which hasn't changed that significantly since the Constitution was written, needs to change. And we'll have to, I think, rethink what is the military for? When I started in the Air Force, it was unusual as we had Air Force officers going into Silicon Valley and, on campus at places like MIT and Berkeley and Stanford, and in leading companies like Amazon and Google and Facebook. It was unusual at first that we had military officers there. And by the time I left 3 years later, it actually became normal for this company. It was something that they valued, that they wanted. And for the military officers that were there, they came back understanding about the challenges and the opportunities that these leading institutions were creating that move much faster and more broadly than the U.S. government does. And so I think that what needs to happen, and it's going to take a lot of support and coalitions within the U.S. government and with allies and partners as well, is that the boundary of national security needs to be removed, and militaries need to be responsible for dealing with national security, period, without boundaries. And increasingly, the things we will worry about will not be the things that heretofore were in the center of the box: kinetic warfare, large scale mobilization, though it's likely that we'll need to be ready for those. I think it will be more gray zone tactics, misinformation, supply chain interdiction, which right now we're not organized to do. And the role the military can play is as a trusted actor. It is a strategic benefit for this nation and for many of our allies and partners that the men and women in military are trusted individuals. They're thanked for their service. They've committed themselves to a life of public service, and they have the trust of our society. Should we ever lose that, it's probably the sign that the beginning of the end has come. And then the role, I think, of civilians, we've already discussed it. They obviously need to represent the population that the military defends. The way that our system of government was drafted, I think, is still the one that I want to live in. But I think increasingly the civilian part of the civ-mil relation needs to represent the leading thinking, the leading tradecraft, and to Zach's point, the leading technology, the leading technical skills in private industry. Our nation should demand that people serving on the civilian side of militaries are bringing something to the table other than the fact that they're not in uniform or that they're a stability function working as military officers change. They must increasingly represent those aspects of our nation that will be difficult to have at a large scale inside the service the way that we have been able to do in the past. That's a lot to ask, but this is a competition for who's going to be leading the next generation economy and likely the military that defends it. So it's a big ask, but I view it as a must do. And I am thankful to see Congress starting to take on some bigger things like let's reform budget. Let's start rethinking how government works. But this will need to be a 5 to 10 year campaign of reform before I'll feel comfortable that we're in a posture to compete long term.
Los, do you have anything to add on to that from your perspective? How is the relationship between the civilian and military side? Are they able to cross over and learn from each other? Kind of what Will was focused on there, and or do we need to see a transformation that he was alluding to also to focus elsewhere?
Sure, and also thank you for your service. It's good to see some, those in the early stages of their career participating in events such as this. So thank you. I think the way I would couch it is, for the UK, we talk about a whole force concept. Mm-hmm. So that talks about the military, the civilian components of the Ministry of Defence and others. It also talks about industry being part of that. Third sector, so charity sectors, and also recognising that actually where our reserve forces come in, more closely aligned, in particular with our army, that the reserve forces play a part in that the army's manpower piece. I would also say, and I think it picks to some of Will's points there. For some specialist skills, we need to operate and act differently, thinking about cyber and cyber effects. The UK is standing up its national cyber force and is looking at how it might resource that, which might mean non-traditional routes. So I think everybody is recognising that this is a team sport, but how we carve that up, probably differs between our nations and the authorities we have.
I'm going to go back to Tim. Did you have another question from the audience out in virtual land?
Sure. Hello, Disembodied World. I represent your voice here in the room. A lot of the conversation here is focused on building resiliency within our own supply chains, but how do we identify critical supply chains for adversary nations, specifically the PRC, and how do we then hold those supply chains at risk in competition to serve as a deterrent or be a decisive factor in a conflict?
So that's a great question, and I think it builds on the one that we discussed earlier about how do we, given an understanding for what the economic landscape is, is there an opportunity to operationalize that insight as a military mission?
Well, I think it's more than a military mission. Again, I'm going to be the economist on the panel here. Look, back to Will's point, you can win militarily and lose the big picture. We cannot lose militarily, but we better win economically. That's the headline. And in order to win in the business environment, you've got to understand your competitors. In military jargon, that would be adversaries. You don't think Google understands Microsoft? You don't think Apple understands IBM? Of course we do. And how is that done? It's done through open source material. It's done through competitive assessment. It's done through pouring through quarterly reports, monthly feeds. It's done through competitive assessment of what they're patenting, who they're hiring, the key ideas that they're putting. It's done through a competitive assessment of what the supply chains look like. Major companies do that as a trade craft, as a form of business. They do that to compete. I would say that the U.S. government does not do that in terms of forming an economic environment for our nation. We do it on an ad hoc basis. And so what your suggestion, the question you're asking is absolutely the right one. How do we ingest large amounts of open source data? Forget the Intel side for a minute. Large amounts of open source data to understand what China's supply chain looks like. Who are they selling to? And what's the credit rating of those buyers 6 months, a year from now? What's that look like? What happens if Laos defaults on their $6 billion loan to build that super highway? What's the impact? What's the next set of contracts going to look like? You can build a model of a country, in this case China, by trying to understand the underpinnings of the top line transactions. And I think that's kind of where you're going. We don't have the infrastructure, we don't have the trade craft, we don't have the analytics in place to do any of that. Somebody can come back and say, Zach, you just don't get it. But I think I probably do. I don't think we have that. I would say companies, in fact, have that in order to sustain their competitive positions. And that's really what, that's what drives. We've got to win militarily, but we better win economically as well.
So if we have that information, who acts on it, and then what's the threshold for action on it?
So industry...
From a competitive standpoint,
yeah,
right?
I would sure think that industry associations care deeply about that. Many folks on this call are familiar with the challenges now in place with the semiconductor sector. Well, the SIA has the NDIA does work in that space. The SIA, there are folks in the call that are part of that. So industry associations are one way to capture and understand that for the member companies. I would, again, think the Commerce Department, I would think that Trade, certainly State Department, those are all signals that should help those departments adjust how they engage. Our partners need to be part of that. And this is not a, we're not in a, this is not a single game contest. It's a multiplayer event.
Right, and you brought up something earlier about that too, Lois, and that the insight of your country probably is different, or you have different access and insights than we would, and again, that collaboration definitely can help us get after what Zach was talking about. Will, did you have anything on that front to add?
No, I think Zach covered it well. It's just so easy when you're sitting in a Pentagon position to default to your job after the conflict begins, and that naturally focuses you on platforms and do we have the best one, and how good are they compared to our adversary, and how long will we have that advantage? You can spend 10 years focusing on those kind of issues and completely miss the entire point. And I would argue even those platform centrists only have a few more decades of being able to have the luxury of doing that, because, I mean, we have major consolidations in the defense industrial base every year. It's not clear to me how much longer it will be a truly competitive industrial base. And, we may eventually just have one mega prime that tells us what it's willing to build for us each year. So the more we focus on economic competition, not only will we be focusing on the right thing, the thing we should be most afraid of and where we have the least critical thinking and the least organizational constructs to be prepared, but we are likely as a windfall to grow a next generation of tech leaders who can help us do pretty amazing things on the military side. And the myth that I hope we dispelled in the Air Force is that Silicon Valley wants to work with us. The tech hubs of the nation, Boston, Austin, want to work with us. Well-respected private investors want to work with the military. We're a first adopter of deep tech. Why wouldn't we? We have non-dilutive cash. Why wouldn't they? We're a purchaser at quantity, so we're a source of recurring revenue that happens completely independently and often earlier than the private sector. There's no downside to it. But we have to think along their lines, which is commercial advantage. And if we're able to do that, and we successfully grow a next generation of companies to economically compete, that define themselves not as .com or .mil companies, but just as .tech, and they build technology and they do business with the government and they do business commercially, that we will have gotten a lot of the tradecraft right to compete long-term economically. And, just take a cautionary tale from what happened with DJI, right? We had that industry emerged in the U.S. first. That class of drones were built by U.S. companies first. There was no strategy, no engagement from the U.S. government, none from the U.S. military, and now that entire supply chain has moved overseas and poses a security risk to us today. I used to have to sign off on those drones being used for any purpose in the Air Force. That's the penalty of not having a strategy. That's the penalty of waiting for a military use case to engage a technology. By the time you wake up and realize that you might have a need for it or a use for it, you're not going to have access to it anymore. And, I just think a lot, for my time in the Pentagon, I felt in most meetings that the people I was sitting around with did not really believe that it was more likely that we would lose. And I believe it's more statistically on paper, the odds are stacked against us in my view. So we're going to have to work harder and smarter because the scale factors are against us in terms of size of our population, size of our economy, China's graduating 15 times the STEM students that we do. Well, the odds are against us. So the urgency should be even higher. And it's not. And I don't know what will shock us into it. And whatever would shock us, China would work hard to prevent. They would like us to be very comfortable until we wake up and realize that the world's changed. So I do fear for us. I hate to be a downer on it, but that's the way I see things right now. And I'll just hope and pray that somehow there'll be a shock to our system that creates the urgency that we need to think about the competition ahead of us at its fullest scale.
Well, that frankness is what we're hoping for, and that's actually the whole purpose of this project, is to elevate a discussion like this so we can help policymakers and industry and partners out address these things substantively. So I think do we have another question from inside the room?
I like how Israel has their draft and everyone has to serve, man or woman, and I understand last year they were considering having women having to register, because it's just men now in the U.S. who has to do it when they're 18. Would it be interesting? Would it be something to rethink how we draft instead of just military? We look at how we draft for all parts of our major agencies when it comes to getting that feeling of service for country, which I think is something that it's used to be around in a big way, but you can see that it's kind of more uniform, say for instance in China and other countries that they have to serve. And then, you know, maybe change it up a bit, not just show that, not to go out into war, but to at least serve your country, man or woman, 2 years. And anything you want to do even like some credits and on, you know, sponsored by the government, just to just bring so many different perspectives and brilliant minds together on the government dime, and eventually they may even come back, or they may stay and grow a beautiful career and contribute in a big way. So that's it.
So the thought of service, mandatory service, as a means to get after this you know, societal level competition, and I'll ask each of our panelists to please, if you will, respond, but also in responding, we only have a couple minutes left, so I would appreciate really a recap of the you know, what your takeaway is, what your top takeaway is for the discussion. And sir, would you? Oh, we'll start with you. Okay, we'll start with you, Dr. Roper.
I think mandatory service would be a difficult thing for us, you know, given the protection of personal freedoms that is also valued and defended by our military. So I think that might be a bridge too far. I absolutely agree that we should pull down all of the barriers that distinguish between men and women in service, so that it is equivalent and honored service. I go back to something I said earlier, is that if we had a different model for working in the government, my experience is that people in the private sector do want to work inside the government. They just don't want it to be their career. I found that true of people working at Amazon and Google and Facebook and SpaceX, and you name them. You get to do things in the government you cannot do elsewhere. You get to do things you'd be arrested for doing elsewhere. So I really think it's a different model where people can feel like they are serving their nation, but in a different construct that makes sense given their ambitions in the private sector. And if that ends up creating a private sector that feels a responsibility to the military, that would be fantastic. I hate that revolving door is pejorative. Revolving door should be our secret to winning. China's going to have the benefit of centrality. But if we could create synergistic markets where there was a frictionless revolving door between them, then the stability of markets would be our strength, and the revolving door would be our weapon to unlock it.
Great insight. Thank you, Dr. Roper, and thanks again for being with us today.
I think to sum up, I would say I can't possibly answer the question about draft. We don't have that in the UK, so I'll put that one aside. But I think what I would say is, you know, this is a team sport. And the team sport for me is industry, government, skilled people, being able to work together across national and international boundaries without friction, the frictions that Will was talking about there, so that we can deliver the best capability to our warfighters quickly. You know, I've talked about barriers, I've talked about export controls, I've talked about, you know, protectionisms within our own countries. But I've also talked about, you know, we can do some startling things together if we put our minds to it. Our forebears did in the Second World War. You know, we've got this opportunity here now to really tackle the hardest problems, grey zone or whatever, to deliver effect. And at the end of the day, if we do that, we'll keep our country safe, we'll have a thriving economy, we'll have bright people working on really good, exciting projects. And at the end of the day, we'll keep our country safe in what is, as we know today, quite an unsafe world.
Clearly, partnerships have been a key theme today across the board. Thank you.
Tim, I want to again end by thanking Jen and the Potomac for hosting this, and Well, it's good seeing you again. And Will, we got to get together at some point. We had a lot to go through. This was a good session. As you'd expect, we haven't reached the end point. We've prompted some dialogue, and that's a good thing. And the problem is a pretty wicked problem. It's a pretty big problem. It's kind of entangled. I would simply say that getting it right as a partnership and thinking carefully about how do we compete in a world where China is clearly positioned to dominate and lead across many industries. Companies that we all rely upon today may not be there 5 years from now. So the question is, how do we marshal our resources? How do we rethink our engagement, government, industry, academia, partnerships? How do we rethink those engagements for effect to address that issue and secure our nations and our environment going forward? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you, Will, for piping in from half a country across the way. Thank you to the Potomac Institute team who helped out. There was a lot of work that goes into setting up an event like this, so I really appreciate it. And thank you for the interactions from online, the questions. Be on the lookout for our next event next month, March 30th. We're going to talk about envisioning competitive advantage in the space domain. We're going to start digging into onto that front. So thank you again for everyone joining us virtually and in person, and hope to see you next time.